All right, team, it's about that time. We're going to be moving a lot during this lecture because we're all about the muscles. So primarily today I'm going to be talking about sliding filament theory, which is in striated muscle, which is cardiac and skeletal. But before we go into that, I want to just define a few differences between the three muscle types, as well as some of their common properties. And then we'll talk about muscle contractions, which is a really cool process, and I've got a great analogy for you to remember. So let's start off with the differences between these three different muscle types. First off, smooth cardiac and skeletal muscle. They're all muscles. They're all going to contract, right? So the first property would be that they are able to contract. That means that they can shorten their length, right? So when you contract a muscle, your muscle's getting shorter. So for all three of these, they can contract. Furthermore, they are also excitable. And what I mean by that is that all of them can be stimulated by your nervous system. So all of these are, they're activated by impulses that are coming from your brain or your spinal cord out to these muscles to excite them so that they can contract. And these are the two that I'm going to talk about the most in these lecture series. The other two are common properties. You can probably guess them. Muscles are elastic, so they can stretch pretty well and recoil based upon force. And they are also extensible. Extensibility is very important because if you extend your muscle, like my biceps, out as far as it can go, it can also contract back. So it can extend, but it can also contract back. Now let's differentiate these three. So let's start with if you can control them voluntarily. So if you can actively move a muscle, it's a skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscles are all voluntary, whereas the other two, your cardiac, your heart, is involuntary. You don't have to think to move your heart, thankfully, because I would probably be dead. And then smooth muscle, your intestines, all these other things, it is also involuntary. You're not actively thinking about moving them, so it is involuntary. Secondly, we can define these based on whether or not they have striations. And these striations are going to be contractile units that we're going to talk about in a second. Two of them have striations, cardiac and the skeletal. So these will function similarly in their contractions because they have the similar contractile units. The smooth muscle acts a little differently. So these have no striations. All right. I should have started with this one, but think about it. All muscles move stuff, right? And depending on what they move, they're going to be a different class. So for skeletal muscle, obviously these are moving your skeleton, so your bones. Your heart is pumping blood, so your cardiac muscle moves or pumps blood throughout the body. And then finally, your smooth muscle does a lot of things. So let me give you a couple. It narrows and widens vessels, so blood vessels, as well as your bronchioles in your lungs, your bronchioles, so your tubes in your lungs. It moves food in your GI tract, so this is your GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract. It can push a baby out if it's your uterus. It can move your hairs up for your erector pili muscles. So the smooth muscle, there's a ton of types, and we'll talk about them in detail later on. So I'm just going to leave it at that. It's separate. And then lastly, with two of these, there's this type of automatic rhythm that goes with it. So with the cardiac muscle, your heart is constantly beating at a certain pace. So it's going to be stimulated rhythmically. And your smooth muscle is also could be considered rhythmic. So when you get hungry in the morning and your stomach's contracting and making noises, it happens around the same time of day. So we could consider these to be a rhythmic contraction. Whereas your skeletal muscle, if we were having rhythmic skeletal muscle, we'd be twitching constantly like this. So we have non-rhythmic skeletal muscle, which is good because we want to be in control of these. These are automatic. This is voluntary. So those are a few things that are different about three muscle types. But for the rest of this Chapter 9 series, we're going to primarily be talking about the skeletal muscle. Specifically, the striations within the skeletal muscle. So the question is, how do muscles contract? How do your skeletal muscles actually contract? It's actually rather simple. With the striations, so with the striations in your skeletal and also your cardiac, what's happening is you have basically a bunch of columns, okay? And you can see how they're kind of far apart. And the goal when you contract is you want to shorten, right? You want to shorten the distance. So basically, as you contract, the distance between those up and down lines are going to decrease. So that's a contraction. We are extended here, and we contracted here. So, if you were to zoom into your sarcomeres, which are your contractile units, so this is a sarcomere, sarco meaning muscle, mere meaning part, so it's literally a muscle part. This is the base unit of contraction in your muscles. Now you're going to have a lot of other structures as you get bigger and bigger, but the sarcomere is the one that we're going to really focus on, as well as the filaments and the proteins inside of it. So, just like I said, those lines need to come together. That corresponds with the lines in the sarcomere. So this line and this line here, well, it's not really a line, it looks kind of like a Z. It's called the Z line. So these are the Z lines over here. And the goal of this is to bring these Z lines together towards this kind of invisible line in a way, called the M line. So what we want to do to contract our muscles, again, is to pull the Z lines closer together. How do we do that? Well, we've got a lot of structures to help us out, so let's point them out first. This little blue structure that are extending from the out pushings of the Z line, these are actin filaments. Actin is a protein. It's relatively thin and kind of flexible, but in this case, it's going to be pretty strong and straight. We also have myosin, which is very thick, very dark and red, so these are the dark parts of your striations. And they're going to have these little myosin heads sticking off, which we'll talk about in a second. So these are the myosin heads. There we go. And then we also have, keeping all this together, we have this very long protein that you see extends from both Z lines down and around. This is called titin. Play on words, because a titan with A-N is like this big mythological giant. Well, this is the biggest protein that your body makes, or I think it's the most dense protein. It's super, super dense, super, super big, and it holds those Z lines basically together by forming it on these different sides. Okay, so these are the proteins that we're working with right now. Remember, to contract the muscle, we want to move the Z lines together. So what's going to happen? Well, you can kind of see, well, the myosin heads, what if they were to pull the actin closer together? That would put all of these Z lines together as well. Okay, so that's basically what a muscle contraction is. Myosin is going to pull the actin towards the M line, thus moving the Z lines together towards the midline. Now, your muscles only contract when you want them to, for your skeletal muscles, right? So that's going to be sent by a nerve impulse, which we'll talk about later. And that nerve impulse is going to initiate something so that they contract when you want them to. So let's walk through this. But before I walk through it, I'm going to give you an analogy. If you were to want to ride a bike, okay, so you want to get to your bike and you want to ride it. Well, of course, you live in the city, so you locked your bike up. You put a chain around your bike, you put a padlock on it, you locked it up so nobody would steal your bike. Very good call. Well, in order for you to use the bike, right, you need a key for your lock. So you're going to unlock that bike lock, thus pulling off that long chain that you were basically protecting your bike with. And then once that chain is off, now you can get on the bike and start riding and being happy. See how this analogy works with what I'm about to show you. Okay. Zoom in on actin. Actin is surrounded by what's called a tropomyosin. Tropomyosin. This is a long chain that covers actin. Interesting. It's the bike chain. You'll also see these little projections off of them, and these are troponin proteins. So troponin, this is your lock, okay? In order to have actin bind with myosin to contract together, what has to happen is we have to pull off this tropomyosin so that the actin and the myosin can interact. So how do we do that? We need a lock, or a key, right, for the lock. the key for the lock is calcium ions. So calcium ions will bind to troponin, thus pulling off tropomyosin. Once that happens, there will be little projections on the actin themselves, and these are, actually I should show them right here. There we go. And these will be myosin binding sites. So, once the myosin binding sites are available, because we pulled off tropomyosin, now myosin can basically grab that actin and pull it towards the centered line. And that is called a cross-bridge power stroke, because we're making this bridge and they're pulling them together. Now, hopefully that makes sense. That was like a bicycle analogy. Let's walk through it really fast. You want to ride the bike. You want to contract your muscles. You want to have myosin and actin pull themselves towards the M line. What do you have to do? Well, you have to get a key, calcium, to unlock troponin, to pull off the tropomyosin, that bike chain, so that now your actin and myosin, your bike and yourself, can interact and contract. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful for that. Now, whenever we're moving something in the body, when we're doing work, we usually need one very important molecule that I've harped on frequently, and that's ATP. Remember, the energy currency molecule for the cell. So what happens before this all occurs, it contracts, ATP will bind to the myosin heads and get hydrolyzed. So it'll get broken down into ADP plus a phosphate. So the ADP and phosphate will be bound to the myosin head, but remember, when we hydrolyze ATP, we release energy. So where's the energy going? The energy is used to basically cock the myosin head. So now it is ready to contract. So since it just hydrolyzed that ATP, it basically cocks its head, and it's basically going to be like a bungee cord, where once actin binding or myosin binding sites are available to it, it's going to grab on and pull it. Okay, so ATP is being used to basically store that energy in the myosin head to then, once it's available, pull actin towards the M line. So once that power stroke is initiated, ADP and the phosphate are going to fly off of it, and then another ATP needs to come in and cock it again and pull the actin. So the more basically you contract your muscles, the more energy you're using, because the more ATP you're using. Now, I didn't ask this in class, but I think this is an important point. Muscle cells have a lot of one organelle. Guess what organelle that is? If you're watching this video, please drop it in the comments. What organelle would be really common in a sarcomere? Well, not necessarily in a sarcomere, but a muscle fiber, a cell, muscle cell, in order that we have plenty of ATP to go around to make these contractions happen. Again, hope this was helpful. Be sure to like and subscribe, y'all.